Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm thinking that I will talk for about 50 minutes. Is that okay? Somewhere around. I've never held this lecture before, though, so I don't know if it's longer or shorter, but hopefully something like that. This is a photograph from France a few years ago when they franchised a new law concerning burkini, the veil, and outlawed veils on public beaches. And of course, this was a law directed towards women. They mostly are. And it's usually about women's clothing. It usually is. Regarding Saudi Arabia or something like that, you're not wearing enough clothes. Woman. And in this case, in France, you're wearing too much clothes, woman. And we see this kind of public humiliation, very common in the history of anti-democracy. And the thing about this law, though, is that it's instated in the oldest territorial state democracy in Europe. La République française, oh, la crève de la liberté. Allons, enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire, l'arrivée contre nous de la tyrannie. And the tyranny in this form is apparently this woman having too much clothes on. So they pointed guns at her. Electrical pistols, is that what it's called in English? And pepper spray. And they said, take off your clothes. And as you can see on the people looking at this, we're not really feeling very happy about this. They're sort of concerned. But none of them intervenes. None of them say anything or sort of. So we have a sort of classical portrait of tyranny in the form of perpetrator, victim, and bystander. That's an image that's very well known to us in Europe since the November pogrom, which was on this date in 1938 in Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany was, of course, an entirely different state from democratic France. But we see the same thing. We see this public humiliation concerning the other person, and we see the victim. We only see the hand of the victim, though, and we see the bystander. Much of the same expression on the faces. Can you notice that? But they don't do anything. Now, the problem about this picture from a democratic point of view is that this is a French citizen. She's a French citizen, and she has democratic rights. She can vote, and she can write in the papers if she has the ability and the opportunity to do so. Why then is she excluded from democracy in this very brutal fashion? Why is it so important that she will take her clothes off in public? And what relationship does it have to this Jewish person being shaved in public, and so on and so forth? Ideology, democracy, hated and vulnerable. The ideology, post-democracy. I've been asked to talk a bit about post-democracy today, and the politics of inclusion. Now, this book of mine started 6 years ago when I was encountered with the problem of defining democracy. Whose book is this? Is it yours? Can I borrow it? Yes. I was at a scientific seminar with regarding democratic research with 6 experts on stage. And during the plenum, one of the participants asked the experts, "Well, then, what is democracy?" And they couldn't answer. We were talking about democracy for 2 hours, and what is democracy? Nobody could answer. They sort of started to name a sort of shopping list of key concepts of modern Western liberal democracies since the 19th century, like voting, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of organization, so on and so forth, freedom of... this is sort of we started describing democracy as we know it today, which is kind of strange, and also sort of stereotype conception of modern democracy has to be like it is in sort of Sweden, otherwise it's not proper democracy and everything like that. And I noticed in some many cases, this is a handbook for Democrats, very nice book, very, very good book. It's about, how do we protect democracy? But if you try to look upon, and read this book and say, what is democracy then? They don't tell you. You're supposed to know already, somehow, what democracy is. And it's very hard, because if you read political science, it's sort of, democracy is perceived as a system of government, or a way to make decisions. You can vote, and then it's sort of democracy. So there is a motion raised today at Konstfack. I don't know if you read about it, but there's a motion raised today that we should exterminate all the Jews at Konstfack. We should kill all the Jews at Konstfack. You heard about it? So we're going to put it to a vote. How many is for this motion? Thank you. And how many votes no? That's you two. Maybe you're Jewish. Yes. They're Jews. Well, as we take this decision, it's democratically, we have a strong voting majority for exterminating all the Jews at Konstfack. Now we sort of feel in our guts that is this really democratic, this sort of method of making a decision? Is this truly democratic to exterminate a certain people or a certain race or something like that? No, we don't. It's not the case, really. Exactly. So, what then is democracy? If it's not, the rule of a majority or something like that. The lack of definition makes it hard to use the concept of democracy in scientific research, I state, since nobody can really tell what it is. Therefore, you have to protect. We have to stand up for democracy. We have to protect democracy, and they don't tell you what it is. So you don't really need to know that. And that's sort of a method in that. If we don't talk about what it is, you can always use this sort of floskler på engelska. Vad säger man floskel på engelska? Stereotype, sort of. What, sorry? Okay, thank you. All right. Furthermore, the lack of a definition of democracy makes it hard to tell what state in the world is democratic and what state is not democratic, undemocratic, maybe even a dictatorship. Since, we're sort of counting states. This is democratic states. Yes, Sweden, very democratic state. And this is sort of China, not a very undemocratic state, with a dictatorship. And then there are all those states which are in between. For example, Russia, the Federation of Russia, which is, if you look at the laws, it's a very democratic state. But if you look at the common day politics, like for here, Pussy Riot being condemned for anti-social activities, as we would have said in an ancient Soviet Union. It's not a democratic state. No, says the political science. No, it's not really a democratic state, but it's not a dictatorship either. It's a soft authoritarian state. All right? And the United States has been downgraded from a full democracy this year from a full to a flawed democracy. It's flawed now. Right, what does that mean? Is it a democracy? Yes, kind of a democracy, yes, but it's not democratic. So there's this uncertainty how to define democracy, and as such it is. Then I propose, and many other people also, that democracy may be more fruitfully understood as an ideology instead of a sort of a system. An ideology which is based upon inclusion and dialogue. Those are suffragettes in Reading in 1907. And they votes for women, votes for women. They want to be included in the dialogue between society and state. For example, via the right to vote, or be recognized as human beings, which is a very common thing in democratic movements. We're also people. Yes, but you're black. You're not. Yes, we're black and we're people. You're Jewish or you're homosexual, and yes, we're homosexual. Gay rights, and everything. We want to be included. We want to be accepted, and so on and so forth. And I said that this could be understood as an ideology, right? And in order to say that, I have to first of all make clear what is then an ideology. What do I mean by the word ideology? And one can understand, according to modern analysis of ideology, the prime example being Michael Frieden, the world's leading authority in ideology analysis. He claims that ideologies are clusters of core ideas. Like, for example, the idea of freedom. Here's freedom, so sort of an atom. And if you combine that atom of freedom with the concept of class struggle, the proletariat, which doesn't own the factories, they compete or they struggle against the capital, which owns the means of production. And that sort of struggle, it's an eternal struggle between the proletariat in history and the sort of owners of production. That makes, that combined makes socialism. Hurrah! Marxism. But if you combine the concept of freedom with the concept of the individualism, the freedom of the individual towards oppressive states and so on and so forth, you have liberalism, right? So basically, Michael Frieden states that ideologies are molecules like the water in this cup. You don't see it, but I see it and I can drink it as well. That's good. This is hydrogen and oxygen, right? Together it makes water. And Michael Frieden says that it's the same way with ideologies. You can sort of combine concepts, which are essentially contestable. You don't have to go into that. Political ideologies then make up sort of political worldviews and sort of political dreams about what utopia should be like. Socialism, I can see it, I can sort of, it's up there in heaven, we find socialism. But upon this earth, and thence the Partiet in Sweden, like the Socialist Party, there's socialist, yes, there's Marxism there, but there's also individualism, there's liberalism, there's nationalism upon this sinful earth. But I can sort of see it. There is my ideal society. It's socialist society, or liberal society, or fascist society, for instance. Nazi Germany was a fascist state, but in practice, Hitler had to cope with conservatives, Catholics, Protestants, and the notion of the old Kaiser, that is monarchism, and so on and so forth. Mussolini, in fascist Italy, he was downthrown by the monarchy. When the sort of authoritarian conservatives got tired of fascism, they sort of got rid of him. So, in practice, ideologies never sort of exist in its pure form on earth, but they are sort of up there in heaven. And they mix with our ideologies and practices on earth. So, what is then the key concept of democracy? Well, we already mentioned it, inclusion. It seems, if you read democratic theory, which I've been doing for 6 years now, there seems to be some sort of consensus in the scientific community that inclusion is like at the key, is the core concept of democracy. The notion that people should be included. This is Swedish workers around 1900, and they want public voting. Everybody should be able to vote, and what they really are saying that we should be able to vote. We workers of the world unite. Sort of, we have a right to vote, and they want to be included in the dialogue with society and state via the right to vote. Albert Weil, one of the most prominent democracy theorists, is that inclusion is central to understanding of democracy, and relatively little attention has been paid to it. Important. Dahl, which is like a sort of senior democratic theorist, is inclusion is one of the cornerstones, and the research has been mostly connected to the idea of inclusion and democracy is, of course, Iris Marion Young, who tragically died a few years ago. But she's like the main political theorist in this field, and she states that democratic norms mandate inclusion as a criterion of political legitimacy of outcomes. Democracy entails political equality, that all members of the polity are included equally in the decision-making process and have an equal opportunity to influence the outcome. And of course, this has never ever happened. Right? It's impossible. People are rich or people are poor. People can write well and people can write less well. People are maybe able to speak in public and have a voice in public, and some people do not. People are downgraded due to color of skin, religion, whatever. When the mass murder monks in south of Sweden, the Sweden Democrat monks, mass murdered people of color in southern Sweden, he had the notion that if I kill these people sort of randomly, the police will never investigate properly, because they will sort of conclude automatically that it's gang violence or some drug dealer or something like that. So he killed people with certain skin colors indiscriminately, and people who never committed a crime in their lives have been, family fathers and whatnot. And the police said, well, this was certainly a drug dealer or something like that, because he had this brown skin. So he was basically right. People are less thought of according to many circumstances, and racism just being one of them. Misogyny and so on and so forth. All democracies violate this norm of inclusion. So we never have had on earth a democratic state, a fully democratic state, according to Iris Marion Young, and I totally agree. But we have more or less inclusive states, and there we can find like Sweden as an example of a more inclusive state, if you compare it to China, for example. Other key concepts in democratic theory are those: qualification, dignity, and diversity. Qualification. This is like the common example of anti-democratic arguments the last 200 years, is that those groups are not qualified to be included. Primarily women, one can say. Charles Darwin stated in the 19th century that, I conducted scientific research upon this, and that men has always competed to each other. We fight and we discuss, right? We are men. While women in history, and during hundreds and thousands of years, men are evolved into mankind, mänskligheten, le droit de homme, and so on and so forth. While women has taken care of babies, and they have remained animals, said Charles Darwin. Therefore, we cannot grant political rights to women, because we cannot grant political rights to animals. We cannot let donkeys vote, and we cannot let women vote. They are not qualified. They are not qualified. As same thing with black people and so on and so forth. They are not truly human. They are sort of animals. And the counter-argument from democratic moments has always been, yes, we are qualified. Thank you very much, Mr. Darwin, or whatever you call yourself today, Mr. Racist or whatever. We are qualified. And this is the workers' movement's argument, that the sort of the power, the people in power say that we love you guys, you're workers, you're in the mine, you're working, that's very well. We cannot demand of you that you should educate yourself politically and sort of be able to vote and things like that. It's for your own good, guys. You're down there doing that, and we're deciding for you. We're doing you a favor. And the workers' union said, of course, thank you very much, but we can understand society we as well. Another key concept is the concept of dignity, human dignity, that people have dignity. The political rights of citizenship is not simply an instrumental device to protect one's interests within a community, though it is certainly that. It also shows it to be a symbolic acknowledgement of civic dignity. You say hello. Hey. Hey. And therefore you show some sort of respect. I see you as a human being, and you see me as a human being. And then I have the power because I'm on stage and I can talk a lot, while you don't, you sit there. But at the same time, we acknowledge each other's existence. That is like one of the key concepts of democracy, dignity, respect for people's dignity. And at last, diversity, the notion that democracy is a better way of having society function, because democracy entails inclusion, and the more people you include in a decision, the easier you can avoid simplification, bias, stereotypes, and things like that. Now we're going to decide how to build houses in Stockholm. And yes, I'm white, I'm male, I'm middle-aged, I'm middle class, I can decide everything. But no, if you take into account other people's experiences and so on and so forth, you get better decisions. And what is the counter-argument from anti-democracy towards this diversity argument? It takes time, blah, 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 discussion and political correctness. And yes, you want to include everybody in the decision. It takes so much time. Let's have some expert or some authoritarian Putin or Trump decide it for us, and we don't have to bother with it. And this has been going on for thousands of years, this argument between democracy and anti-democracy. Effectiveness contra inclusion and diversity. Right? All okay so far? Right, let's go on. So I say that there has never been a democratic state, because no state has included everybody equally, and say that there's never been a total dictatorship, because of the most power-hungry dictator. He needs his military people, he needs his state functionaries in order to run a state. So all societies are in some sort of eternal struggle between democracy and anti-democracy. And this can be going on many levels at the same time. For instance, well, no, we don't want black people in our state, but we can accept homosexuals or Jews or whatever. And so, no, you can't. Yes, I can. And sort of goes on many levels at the same time. I claim that the science of history, I claim that the science of history is the science regarding change. That is at the core at historical science. What kind of did people smoke cigarettes in the 1600s? Yes or no? Those kind of questions we can leave to popular science. I don't care. You can ask like Herman Lindqvist or someone in Sweden. The science of history is concerned with change, and therefore democracy is a very good example of perpetual change going on all the time, all the society. And yes, Sweden is fairly inclusive, and communist China, they execute 15,000 people every year, not very inclusive on them. By a political exclusion, they kill the bodies, but at the same time, the perpetual change. Sorry. Oi. And as we already gave an example of that horrible referendum of ours, should we kill certain people at Konstfack? Then this is a very popular method for anti-democracy to hide behind referendums. Well, should we make these anti-democratic decisions? And no, we really can't, because there's laws against it and things like that. Yes, but we can make a referendum and bypass the democratic establishment via the referendum. For instance, we can bypass the notion of freedom of religion via having a referendum of should they really have their mosque and so on and so forth. And this is a 3,000-year-old discussion. Basically, that was ancient Greece. Is democracy the tyranny of a majority? How can democracy be protected from the sort of notion of the dictatorship of the 51%, that the majority can always overrule the rights and sits in the rights of minorities and other groups, for instance, women? And this debate was still at the core of democratic debate in the 19th century, when democracy, modern liberal democracy, is sort of on its way. So, is democracy freedom or is it anti-freedom? Could the democracy kill freedom via the dictatorship of the 51%? And given the 19th century anxiety, it may say that it was well-founded given the mass political violence, including genocides, the Holocaust, and so on and so forth, during the 20th century, where they basically was proven right. You know, then the sort of the masses of the population can decide upon, let's kill all the Jews in Europe, for instance. So this continues to be a problem, that how can democracy safeguard itself from some sort of tyranny of a majority, right? And the 19th century also saw the birth of social Darwinism. The liberal Herbert Spencer, editor of The Economist, formulated the idea of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. People who are worth being called people are naturally rising to the top, and they become rich and they become powerful and so on and so forth, while the drunk who lies on the street is a drunk who lies on the street because he deserves to be a drunk who lives on the streets, as Mr. Spencer can tell them hello from me. So some sort of conception of that. You can take Charles Darwin's thoughts regarding natural selection and sort of place it in society. And you see that people who are worth something, they rise to the top, and people who's worthless, they sort of drop down to the bottom. No problem. And this was very successful. Because if you were powerful and successful, you yes, okay, that's why I'm powerful and successful. I'm a sort of superhuman. I'm the best. And democracy, equal rights, and so on and so forth was unnatural. We cannot have, because it's sort of it's against nature. It's dangerous, and so on and so forth. And this was an idea which has been around for a long time. Modern day conservatism, for instance, when it was founded in late 18th century, was based upon this, that equal rights and so on and so forth is unnatural. We should have an elite that rules everything. And also Plato's conception of the ideal state from ancient Greece is sort of that smart philosophers should rule instead of democracy. Smart philosophers ruling a sort of oligarchy of smart people ruling, educated in Platonic philosophy primarily, according to Plato himself. They should really rule, and philosophia should rule over doxa, that is, educated people should rule over the uneducated people. And there you find post-democracy, the notion of post-democracy, which is today's rebranding of this 3,000-year idea. Where did I put my water? I lost it. Oh, on my piano. Now, this is being rebranded and relaunched by neoliberalism primarily as sort of, oh, we got something new. We should have a post-democracy instead. And they sort of, they never heard of Plato. Colin Crouch launched this idea in 2000, a post-democratic society, so that continues to have and to use all the institution of democracy, but in which they increasingly become a formal shell. The energy and innovative drive pass away from a democratic arena and into circle of political economic elite. And the background for this, oh, we're coming up with this new thing, was the things that were happening primarily in China in 1989. The heavenly Tiananmen Square massacre. At the same time, democracy was being hailed as a new consensus, and China basically said, let's kill all those democratic protesters. Let's move in with infantry, artillery, and armor, and just kill them all. And then we can have authoritarian rule and capitalistic free markets. And we can sort of show the world that those two can be combined. And this was listened to by leadership primarily, first of all, in Africa, then Putin in Russia and Europe, Hungary and Poland today, for instance, and Latin America and North America, Trump. So more and more has this movement tried to tell us that democracy is a thing of the past, being 1945 to 1989, and today we should have a post-democratic society instead. And the most notable of all these people is Professor Jason Brennan, who's not a political scientist, he's a political philosopher at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And he divides people into hobbits, hooligans, and Vulcans. Now, who can tell me what a Vulcan is? Someone must be a nerd in here. Come on. Thank you. Live long and prosper. That's right. Hobbits, hobbits from the Tolkien stories. Sort of the common stupid people. Most people are hobbits. They don't know, they don't care. And Brennan writes about, despite 200 years of mass education, public schooling and so on and so forth, people are still clueless. And it's for the best if they stay at home on election days, states Brennan. Otherwise we would poison the political debate with their stupid ideas. Hooligans are a special group. They regard politics as some sort of game. Where it's like, yes, oh, hey, my team will win, my team will win, oh, Hammarby. Who follow politics with a partisan devotion of sports fans. And he doesn't like them either. They're stupid too. And last of them, Vulcans from Star Trek. Vulcans in Star Trek are purely logical people. Mr. Spock is the most notable among them. And the Vulcans investigate politics with scientific objectivity, respect opposing points of view, and carefully adjust their opinions to the facts. They should have all the power, those Vulcans. Live long and prosper. That's about Mr. Spock, a Vulcan. And here's the stupid hobbit, which is basically me. And here's like the Hammarby or England. All power to these people with pointy ears. Well, hobbits have pointy ears too. Sorry. Now, what's the problem with this idea then? Why doesn't people generally buy into his ideas? Well, there are several problems. Do Vulcans really exist, first of all? And how do we find them? How do we know if somebody is, well, you're an objective person who sort of analyzes ideas objectively and then sort of decides upon knowledge what party you should vote for. Science is per definition conflict, and scientific truths are defined as temporary truths until they become obvious, like the Earth is round. That's not a scientific debate. That's not science anymore, because we all know that. Besides, maybe some people don't, but anyway. At which point they cease to be science. Thus, Mr. Spock doesn't provide us with objective answers how to govern a given society. If you have two researchers, you have three opinions, right? As a matter of fact, sophisticated experts have been confident about many proposals that turn out to be bullshit. Right? Like invading Iraq in 2003. Well, we have strong evidence here that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and if we invade Iraq and bomb them back to the Stone Age, they of course will be Swedish folkpartister, and they will build their democracy, these brown people. No. Bad idea. But it was, perceived as the proper thing to do. Race biology, same thing during almost the entire 19th century and until 1930s, was perceived as a science. So on and so forth. So if we cannot find these superhuman Balkans, and we don't know how to find them, how can we organize them to rule our societies? Mr. Plato and all you who follow you. Instead, one can see post-democracy as the ongoing de-ideologization of democracy. That democracy is just a way to make decisions. It's just the majority rule. Charles S. Meyer, one of the democratic researchers I quote in my book, says that at the very moment Democrats enjoyed the greatest modern victories in 1889, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the potential for authoritarianism grew threatening once again. Democracy is at its most vulnerable when we think we have won it. Now we have it. Now we have democracy. Then you should look out if you are a Democrat yourself. Why is some hand there? Here's another scientist, philosopher. Today we are finding too often a quasi-liberalism which is committed to the principle of looking sympathetically to all sides. Well, one can be a Nazi. It's very, very, very important to have Nazism. It is a liberalism so objectively analytical that it fails to become subjectively committed. It is a liberalism which has developed a high blood pressure of words and an anemia of deeds. Blodlös in Swedish. This sounds very, very much 2018, right? But it is, to be more precise, 1958, when Martin Luther King, Dr. King, addressed the National Biennial Convention of American Jewish Congress. Democracy can never be objective, should never become objective. At the moment when democracy becomes objective, it's in danger. Democracy must remain confident and knowledgeable of its own ideological ideas, according to Martin Luther King. Right? But it's easy to be a Democrat in theory, and it's harder to be a Democrat in practice. Where does democracy end and unacceptable hate begin? Should we have terror organizations marching through the streets and beating people up? Some people think so, and they say, according to democracy, we must have this sort of violence in the streets because it's very democratic of us to accept this kind of organizations. And we must accept them throwing their hatred towards Jews or blacks or homosexuals or whoever, women, because it's freedom of speech is the most holy principle of all in democracy. And we must be allowed to say that Jews cannot be Swedish, for instance, Sverigedemokraterna politics. Because they're democratic, we're in the parliament, so they must be democratic since they're in the parliament, and thus their opinions cannot be anti-democratic, because then they wouldn't be in the parliament, right? Maybe so. I would say that being uncertain is one of the key elements of democracy, or being democratic. There was a Swedish thinker called Tage Danielsson who said that without a doubt you're crazy. Utan tvivel är man inte riktigt klok. Without a doubt you're stupid, if you understand what I mean. And that was like at the key core of democracy to me, that democracy is uncertain. Has anyone of you ever seen Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back? anyone remember the conversation between Yoda, the Jedi Master, and Luke Skywalker, the young Jedi apprentice, where Luke Skywalker asks Yoda, "Is the dark side stronger?" And Yoda says, "No, it's not stronger, but it's quicker, more seducing, and more easily accessed, and it gives you quicker results," and so on and so forth. But the light side of a force is at the very least as strong as the dark side, but it takes more time and it's more doubtful. And I think this was very wise of Yoda to say this, because that's at the core of democracy. It's hard. It's much easier to be anti-democratic. Yeah, kill them all. They don't belong there. Women shouldn't vote, and so on and so forth. And it's much harder to be democratic and to claim the rights of people who are normally scoffed upon and scorned about, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Henrik.
Thank you.
Just as your book, it was a pleasure to read. I think this was a lot of fun, along with very, very deep insights on the notion of what we live in and what we're facing. Democracy, as you started in your introduction to speak about, is not an easy thing. I mean, when you grew up in a democracy and you went to school in Sweden, as I did, you never really got into this deep shit. And I would say that reading your book is both, really an interesting lesson of history.
Thank you.
And also, by the end of the book, you put out the challenges that we face. And with that being said, I still wanted to go back, and maybe you did answer my first question a little bit in your talk, whether what I thought about was whether democracy is an ideology or if it's a method. My father, who's not educated at all, kind of a simple man, he said something that I remember when I was a kid. He said, democracy is really, really difficult. It's not perfect, but I think it's the best thing we have. And I would say that for me, reading other scholars such as, I always say his name wrong, Yuval Noah Harari, he points out that that democracy, the way he puts it, is a set of rules, but they only work if we have some kind of common grounds. It wouldn't work if it would be totally different. And what we see these days is people, like you pointed out by the end of your talk, that really do think the world should be one totally different. So I guess that is the problem that I see and wanted to dig into a little bit deeper. And then my question then is that what Jason Brennan says that you ditched was that he pointed out different types involved in democracy. And I think the hooligans are interesting these days because they have a way of talking using the internet, the social medias, and going back to the Friday lecture we had some weeks ago, they can also use artificial intelligence because we also vote and make our decisions with our emotions. So I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on democracy and emotions. How do we make our decisions? Because what you said earlier about freedom, being free, included in a larger context, also means that we kind of all have a little bit, I think, of a hooligan in us. We identify with groups of people, and that becomes politics. So how do we face the fact that we now are under attack, I would say, from ideologies other than inclusive ones through through the new media landscape. That was a very long introduction to a question.
Thank you for very interesting thoughts, and thank you for asking me a question which I guarantee cannot answer, but I can, as we say in Sweden, killgissa. Well, I think it's a moral argument or a moral question which makes you happy. And first of all, we're sort of taught that we're all Democrats. And why should we be that? Why should we all be Democrats? Morally, one can say that the best system of government, for if you could perceive democracy as sort of a system of government or method, should be the one who makes most people happy, right? And if you look about it, people are much more happy today in Russia than they were under Yeltsin when Russia experimented with liberal democracy. Under today's authoritarian state, people get paid, they get food, they get their days off, so everything is sort of working more or less in society, unlike it did under Yeltsin in the 1990s, where they had liberal democracy. So in Russia today, democracy is perceived as anarchy, and nothing really works properly, and that was horrible, and we're much better off today under Putin. Now, that's not true if you're Pussy Riot, right? Or if you're, I don't know, Jewish, or publicly homosexual, or LGBTQ movements, so on and so forth. But for most people are happier today than under Yeltsin. So is it a better form of government? Another example is the most popular political head of state ever in the history of mankind, Mr. Adolf Hitler. There was some sort of census being done in 1937 or something like that, when it said that 95% were vote for Hitler today, if there was a vote for against Hitler. People were extremely happy under Hitler, except if you were a Jew or a homosexual, or whatever, handicapped in a different sort of way, challenged. So was then Adolf Hitler the moral best governor of history of mankind? No, he wasn't. He was an asshole. But people were very happy. So given those thoughts, why should we be Democrats? Why should we be free? Why should we bother with state and the relationship between state and society? Well, it seems like it's some sort of box, Pandoras box, which sort of opens and then it cannot be closed again. Feminism is born in 1789 with the French Revolution, and it sort of comes out there. And women aren't satisfied with being put back in the box again after the French Revolution, which they are. So, answering your question.
Well, I think you did, because I think that image of the Pandora's box is very relevant, and I think that is also why I think your book is important, because we need to step back and look at what we actually have gained and not taking it for granted. So that's, I guess, one answer to it. But I also want to propose, we have a professor here, Magnus Bartos, who has recently written the book...
We're Facebook friends.
Bebådaren. I don't think he's here just now, but he's in the building. Bebådaren, about maybe you read it, about fascism and how the Italian fascist movement came about. And one of the conclusions he makes is that it was so, when people felt a little bit lost and didn't find their place in life or the meaning of existence, and this goes through all the different, from rich to poor, when you start to speak about danger and being a hero, or higher meanings of being together, that is so attractive. So I think that is maybe also something that is kind of at stake now, that a lot of people don't really find their place in this complex world where capitalism kind of have taken over all the things that we all kind of in that web of merchandise. And if someone calls for something that has a greater, deeper meaning, over there, it's very attractive. That's my personal opinion.
Well, I think as we are at Konstfack, if a certain party would gain power and being given the power of a culture ministry, and they would come here, they say, you can have millions and millions and millions of Swedish kronor as long as you do huge paintings of Gustav II Adolf at the Breitenfeld, and you should do great works upon Gustav Vasa or whatever. You would be surprised how many of your students and colleagues who would, after initially, complaining a bit, no, we don't like it, and then they would just embrace it. And we see it in all history of authoritarianism, how artists and people of creative people, they sort of indulge into authoritarian rule and authoritarianism, authoritarian architecture and cinema and art and things like that. So we know this.
Yeah.
No, it's because it's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah.
You will get to do with the nation. And at last, Albert Speer in Germany, when he sort of prepared the notion of a new capital, there was enormous enthusiasm. And you have seen Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph der Willen.
It's impressive.
One of the best movies ever made. And
that.
The Birth of a Nation, the movie about Ku Klux Klan, is considered one of the best movies ever, and together with the Soviet movie with stairs. What's it called? Eisenstein, the Cruise of Potemkin. Yes.
Yeah.
Those are all totalitarian arts, and it's a wonderful thing to be a part of, I'm sure. But then some people don't get to be there. The Jews were killed and so on and so on.
And I think we have to recognize it and see it, and we have to find our own meaningful things to do that is just as strong. I think that is the response. Lolo.
So I think that this question that I saw on the poster, is democracy vital for the future human? It's kind of interesting because it also shows that maybe there's an alternative, and maybe there is also an attack on democracy that doesn't come from where we're looking now. We're painting the Sverigedemokrater, the liberals and all these.
Yes,
this is like the major. But maybe maybe the ecosystem is a antagonist for democracy. I'm thinking, in a way, also what you are saying. We are forced to kind of know something about democracy in the absence of what we could actually recognize as the experience of democracy, in the same way that we have to imagine our freedom in the absence of it somehow. And what I'm very much one of your last points, which was this also the connection between self-defense and self-denying, in the sense that you painted this, like how Nazism is depicted as a kind of uncomfortable, maybe at best despicable opinion, among others, that we as a democracy should tolerate, which I think is very close to what we work with. This is a question that comes up. So what is the end of democracy, kind of? And that then, that this desire to say that democracy, I am not what you say that I am, and that then in order to disavow that, I also have to kind of disavow what it is that I am somehow, and that we're doing that constantly, and that we don't only have to kind of refute this insult against democracy, but then we also have to figure out how we can do that and still, remain and be something other than that insult somehow. And that is one thing that I find interesting.
One can imagine if the climate crisis now develops and we experience some sort of global crisis for real, people actually dying in the millions or maybe even billions, and then some sort of world dictatorships is being established. Now we must combat climate change via drastic and unpopular politics. And then maybe they would say that, look, democracy failed us. Democracy has failed. We really needed anti-democracy and this sort of powerful dictatorship in order to fix everything. And that has actually been the case quite recently with money politics. The central banks of nation states were lifted out from democracy, Riksbanken in Sweden, for example, because they said that democracy, in the 1970s, they said that democracy means perpetual inflation. Democracy cannot combat inflation because this populist politics will always encourage inflation over political stability in the currency. So, and nobody really noticed. This is an extremely important part of the state, money politics. And they sort of took it out from democracy and said that this is better because democracy cannot cope with money politics. So maybe in 50 years we will say, we were so stupid, we were Democrats. How could we have been so stupid that this democracy created this crisis of the climate? Who knows? This has actually happened once when in 1940 the democratic states of France and Great Britain gave up the struggle towards Nazi Germany. We were defeated militarily quite easily on the continent. They sort of, this doesn't go so well. Let's all give up. Oh, no, you're one, Mr. Hitler. And then in 1941 Hitler attacked the Soviet Union and the Red Army was erased. He totally erased the Red Army once. And the Soviet Union didn't give up. They created a new Red Army, and that was also erased by the Nazi forces. And the third Red Army was also erased until the fourth survived, and eventually Stalin defeated Hitler. And then the word said, look, democracy couldn't defeat Hitler. It took a totalitarian dictatorship, Stalin's Russia, to defeat Hitler because he didn't care about the losses. He didn't care about the costs. So from time to time during history, democracy has been said, this is soft, it's feminine, it cannot cope with real, proper crises. So we don't know about the climate crisis. But maybe democracy will combat climate change. I hope so, because I'm a Democrat.
Yeah, but it's also that, in a way, maybe, especially in this lecture, that there's a way of placing democracy in these, grand narratives. Modernity, tradition, communism, capitalism, fascism, and it's also a grand narrative that kind of does not include the history of democracy in Africa, such
exactly.
That lies. And I know that in your book you have a mention of this.
Yeah, I have a chapter about that.
But that you mention it also as a kind of informal democracy, that if colonialism had not happened, what would we have known somehow? But when I think of this question, like, is democracy vital? Then, so if we could we think through some of the things that we've learned to kind of love and that attracts us under this rubric of democracy, but to see if that's possible to think of against a completely different grain than this, grand narratives, and is that maybe where something else, a different way of relating to?
I think you're very perfectly right, and I say to my book that we had all kinds of democracy being, coming in the world when colonialism sort of kills off everything in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, in Australia, and so on and so forth. We do not know what would have happened in Southeast Africa, for instance, in modern-day Tanzania, with the movements that were being created there.
But if we
so at this point we don't know, but I think that's one of the sad points of human history, that now we have modern-day Swedish liberal, neoliberal, capitalistic democracy, and that's how democracy should be like. And for instance, we had free elections in Tunisia, like 15 years ago, and this Islamistic party won, and there was a coup d'etat, and the military sort of ended democracy, and everybody in the West said, good, because you voted wrong. But we do not know what could have happened. post-Islamistic society.
And then, well, I'm going to continue maybe because if in a way, then we also look at democracy as a way out of this modernity, and the modernity being produced by, the ongoing, processes of slavery and settler colonialism, but also the distribution of sovereignty, at the democratic distribution of sovereignty. So then, what happens? This distribution of sovereignty is also inflicting sovereignty, and so it's not just what we put a lot of importance into the distribution, but is it possible also to think democratization without the sovereignty?
And you also then nationalism, I guess. And that's one of the key arguments in democratic theory. Is nationalism necessary for democracy? That important? Or is nationalism bad for democracy? Because the nation states is based upon the idea that in Sweden lives the Swedes, and all Swedes in Sweden, and Sweden is for Swedes. And that has never been true. Has always been Finns, there have been Roma people, there have been Jews, there have been whatever, living in these boundaries. And when Per Albin Hansson was prime minister from the war period, he stated in 1928, the folkhemstal, the people's home. Det goda hemmet känner inga styrbarn, där är alla snälla mot varandra och jämlika. And the people's home is everybody's night is over. But even the people's home has walls. So what if you're a Jew and coming in 1938? Well, you're not welcome. But anyway.
But one thing that a nation state, what is included have also been negotiated and changed over time. I think we have to keep that in mind. And I think one thing that, at least myself, that I see is the purpose of the nation state still is to keep the laws for democracy. Because that is the least guarantee, even if it turns out that even the law can be changed by someone who comes in through democratic elections. I think we should maybe open the floor for questions. Any one of the master students having a question
or criticism
or comment or...
Okay, thank you. I'm not a master student. I just began the teacher program here at Konstfack, and I just had a course in school and society where we discuss that the school has two equally important missions, which is the education mission to teach people a subject or the students a subject, and it's also the democratic mission. And those are equally important, and it says in the school law, and it says in the läroplan. I don't know what that is in English. And which is really interesting because when we discussed that in the course, it's very vague. As you said, you were at some place where the democratic, where democracy weren't even possible to define. And so when we study about democracy in school, it's very pretty words, of course, and you foster someone to use it. And it's also like they say that the most important democratic tool is samtalet, or to speak to each other. The dialogue, exactly. I don't know if you looked into this democracy mission that is stated in the school, because I just think it's interesting.
Yes, I did. I write about it in the book.
Okay, great.
Because there's a third mission as well of schools, and that is disciplinary. To discipline the citizen into being a proper citizen and behave accordingly. If you look upon us here today, we're all dressed approximately the same. We have some sort of level of how we dress. We're sort of a bit cool, it's hipster, and you have your Adidas clothing on, and you sort of... Who told us this in the morning? Well, you're supposed to dress. You have this cap on, and you have your beard, and you should look like that. And some people have their hats on and things like that. No, you didn't call each other this morning to check how to clothe, but we all know how to dress at Konstfack. And that is a very, very interesting process. Foucault would have loved this, Michel Foucault, the disciplinary force of schooling. But then you're right. You're perfectly right. In a democratic state, students are disciplined into being Democrats. In Nazis schools, they were disciplined into being Nazis, and this is better. And you're absolutely right. And it's a problem because we've always been teaching since 1945 the school students that they should, for instance, be critical upon media. We should beware when you read media or watch TV. And that was all fine and dandy when all there were was Dagens Nyheter and Rapport on TV. But today there are like Nazi media and there are Sweden Democrat media and there are Flashback and everything. And those darn students are doing as we are told. They question Dagens Nyheter and Rapport and they say, well, I read this on this racist website that the Holocaust has never occurred and things like that. And we're like, whoa! You understand what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
They're questioning mainstream media. They're undemocratic, but they're only doing as we're told, basically. And that sort of describes a pluralistic media environment of today and the problem of schooling that today, well, we have newspapers at school. You can read Dagens Nyheter where we say exactly. Today, people are given more and more channels alternative to schooling, and that makes it harder to school people or discipline, as Foucault would have said, into Democrats because they read our stuff and we're horrified by it. What's your opinion?
Well, I don't know really. I just wrote a short paper on it, and that was just a first attempt to address what it is. And I was taking part of some. There's a podcast that speaks about how to work in school. There's different teachers that comes up with, or that gets interviewed about their techniques, and one of them talked about that it was a mathematician teacher, and he spoke about that his first lessons with a new group, the only thing he worked with was the relationship between him and the group and between the students themselves, and because he said that all your cognitive processes are basically locked down when you're in a new situation because of the stress. So that is like the criteria of even having children to think and be able to work. And so I just thought that was an interesting practical example of how you could actually create a climate where maybe a democratic dialogue could exist, because you have to get these students to be secured in the room or safe in the room. So I just think it's so much around it that it's like, I don't know. It's really interesting to speak about techniques and practical techniques. So and I think it's easy to just say like, yeah, they should be democratic, like they should respect human rights. And
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It's and also the way they were organized in schools. That in one school, I'm not going to talk too long, but in one school they were reforming the classes all the time. So students would get to know each other and get to know others. So they would work against the others, like the other class or the other. So that was a way of mixing people. And that's also something they bring up, like social meetings to get the school to make social meetings happening more and more. That's also a technique. But yeah, it's just interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
To hear voices from our teachers program, which is really, really important in many ways in this environment. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hello. I'm still clinging on to this one sentence that I thought was really something true, that democracy is heavily being in the state of uncertainty.
Yes.
And I'm still recovering from your statements, the historic kind of black and whiteness you pulled out of your head somehow, because kind of I feel that democracy heavily has something to do with complexity and kind of accepting as well that you are in a state of uncertainty, that the complexity is so heavy that we're just kind of tending and leaning towards making black and white statement. And I wonder, kind of, is there a reason why you, for example, pull out numbers like 95% of German people were happy in the Second World War
No,
period.
no,
which is kind of
1937, before the Second World War.
because kind of I want to, you know, like, again, there is the complexity lacking, because the situation is not just kind of we pull Jews out of their houses and we kind of kill everybody who is kind of disabled, but the situation in the state and the state for everybody was so fucked up that it's really hard to pull these statements and be so black and white about it as well, kind of to make statements about today's Russia, just to say that people in general are much more happy. And I think this generalistic approach of kind of always saying like, this is like it is today and this is not like it is today, I find that very difficult to understand, especially when dealing with democracy and this uncertainty, why there's no space for sensitivity and complexity somehow. And the second question I have, beyond kind of your choice in examples in this black and whiteness, is as well to understand today there are, as you said, like there's a popular way of dressing, there's a popular way of being democratic, there's a popular way of doing things, but behind the scenes these people are not voicing that they are going to vote Trump, for example, happen to be the majority to vote then in the end Trump. So the lack of conversation beforehand, because it's also black and white and kind of everybody's just popularizing basically these kind of common statements, owning a space, that there is a lack of conversation, there's a lack of being approachable as well in these different kind of uncertainties. And I wonder if you have as well tools or spaces where you see these discussions emerge and where there is a space for this complexity as well to happen. And yeah, that's my question.
Thank you for very interesting thoughts. First of all, I was talking about Nazi Germany in 1937. That is 2 years before the World War, and that's 1 year before the Kristallnacht.
Still,
Just after the
situation was
Olympic
very
Games, the regime was extremely popular, as well as Mussolini's regime in Italy. The second outbreak of the Second World War wasn't very popular in Germany. They didn't want war. They were worried about how that would affect them. But the main part of your question is then, how about the excluded ones? And that was my point as well. If you were a Jew or a Roma, for example, you
or
were
a
not
German
happy.
city, because
Or if you were a social democrat and things like that.
exactly.
Exactly. But the extent to that the popularity of the regime was remarkable. It was remarkable. And it was also thought among large groups in Europe that this was the proper democracy, the democracy of a majority. This was how democracy should really function, like the sort of a power of many people. And my point in this is that we tend to say that people are happy when they are free. We don't know that, at least. I think we can agree upon that. When in the 1950s, they voted in Switzerland regarding the vote of women. Should women be given citizenship? And there was a huge female organization against the female vote. It was we are happy if we're at home, we women, if we are at home and we're not given citizenships and things like that, we are more happy if then we should be given suffrage. Also in the abolitionist movement, there was a sort of a black vote of we're happier if we are slaves. If we're given freedom and we should be out of a labor market and we will have a horrible situation. Now we're being taken care of and we have homes, we work, and we don't have to worry about anything because we're happy slaves. So the concept of a happy unfreedom, as in Russia today and the Nazi Germany situation, but also other states, is a complex one. And we're making a mistake if we think that when we're free, we're happy, because we don't know that. It may be the case, but we don't know that. I'm sorry, now I forgot your question.
The second question. No, but I'm happy that you're saying like we don't know that, because it's true. Unless you're Russian in the situation you're in, you don't know it. And I think it's important sometimes as well to accept that you don't know it, and that the state of uncertainty is what constitutes our choices, and being understanding basically your personal bias and the tendency to always black and whiting everything.
It's like in The Matrix. I'm more related to science fiction movies, but you know, The Matrix, where the character wants, why didn't I take the blue pill? Why did I stay in
exactly.
in unfreedom? And can you take me back to unfreedom? Ignorance is bliss. And of course, they're not happy being free, because it's a miserable situation. But there's some sort of dignity in this position of being free, which makes people strive after it. Even though, you know, the feminist movies of the 19th century, the woman wants to be free, even though, but you're safe here with your husband who basically owns you, and you don't have economic rights, you don't have civil rights or anything. So I think that's something very optimistic about that. There seems to be some sort of a DNA structure which strives for freedom, and it may sound stereotype and stupid, but there seems to be something like that.
And the second question was maybe more constructive around tools or platforms that you see where this kind of complexity in a dialogue can take place, when you see often that there's a popular voice always surfacing and the unpopular is disappearing in the background, but still then gaining so much power that it actually pulls the strings. So do you see somewhere these platforms emerging, or as well tools that these conversations could kind of happen?
Yes, if we wanted to, and not everybody wants it to, because I think that's concerns for hooligan figure and things like that. One of my best friends in schools has moved to the United States, and she's pro-Trump, very much so. It's a very, very valuable friend, because people can ask, why do you like Trump? You know, and she says, all this discussion in Sweden, we always debating things, but we want the small life. She has a bakery, and I want this sort of simple life with my bakery, and you know, you don't have to talk about everything, making everything complex and difficult. Let's keep things simple, and I make my cakes. Voltaire's Candide, have you read that? Let's garden. Let's take care of our little garden, the small life, and we don't have to bother with larger complex things. So there you have it.
So there is no discussion.
Oh.
If I understood you correctly, the main issue that you were trying to raise through this talk is what's the future of democracy?
Yes.
And I was trying to linger on that thought throughout your talk, sort of grasping for the red thread, and was struggling with that because you were very successful in showing that there is a major difficulty to define what democracy is.
Yes.
You cannot define it in terms of happiness, you cannot define it in terms of objectivity, you cannot define it in terms of governmental procedures. It seems like you cannot even define it in form of like what it is not, because if the maybe first thing that comes to my mind would be some kind of authoritarianism or tyranny, but democracy can be just as oppressive for some people in different ways. So at the end, as if you cannot define more specifically what you mean by democracy, the question becomes, what is the future of the thing we cannot define? And how meaningful is that question? And would it be possible then to reduce or refine it into something more specific. What is your question about?
Do you understand Swedish?
Yeah.
Yes. How many here does not understand Swedish? Could you just excuse me for, because I've written a definition in Swedish. I'm so sorry. I will try to, if you come to me. Demokrati är en folklig politisk ideologi som i sin idealtypiska form strävar efter maximal jämlik inkludering av största möjliga mängd människor, medborgare, i den offentliga dialogen med samhälle och stat, samt maximal jämlik inkludering i samhälleliga relevanta beslutsprocesser utifrån en övertygelse om mångfaldens överlägsenhet samt alla människors lika värde, kvalifikation och värdighet. Det är min förslag på hur man kan definiera ideologi, alltså demokrati som en ideologi. Och det här är ju liksom ett mål. Det är dit vi strävar.
Maybe you can speak English again.
Yeah, sorry, English. That's the sort of our goal. The conviction of the superiority of inclusion. All people have the same worth and qualification and dignity and things like that. And then you hear someone on the street says, gay people are horrible, you shouldn't love them. And then you can sort of remember this definition, and then you can say, formulate a politic of your own. Say, no, I don't agree with you. I think all people have the same values, and so on and so forth. But then you meet people. We should outlaw Nazism, and then you have a problem, right? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, of course.
Yes,
It's self-contradictory. Yeah, democracy.
And then her phone is ringing, and should you outlaw that? Yes, it's difficult, but it's possible. It is possible to. No, I can't.
What is possible?
It is possible to say that no, I cannot allow you to exterminate Jews. That is not. I cannot allow this politic to happen. I cannot agree with. You have a right to be a Nazi. I can't change what's inside your head. But when you're out marching, I can say no to you marching. I can sit down in front of you. Civil disobedience, as Dr. King taught us, for example, non-violent disobedience, like people did in Jönköping when the Nazis were marching. They sat down and saying, Jesus älskar alla barnen. They sat in the way of Nazis. And they were arrested and the courts sentenced them to punishments for doing this. But they did it anyway. So it's possible, but as Martin Luther King taught us, you have to sit down and think for a while before you act. Am I really right? Am I doing this correctly? Well, should I sit down on the street and stop the Nazis from marching? Is this morally right for me? And the anti-democracy wouldn't think twice; they just sort of do it.
Okay, it was quite a complicated definition that you provided, and you didn't specifically sort of given it, so it's difficult now to start digging into that in detail. So I'll skip that part and rather than ask, okay, if your question is what is the future of that specific definition of democracy?
Yes.
Do you think you have an answer to provide as well?
Yes, I don't see any democratic light anywhere in the world right now. I think we're going straight into an authoritarian era. I don't see anyone formulating democratic resistance anywhere in the world, basically. No democratic leadership anywhere. So I don't see a Martin Luther King, I don't see Hannah Arendt, I don't see Ernst Wigforss anywhere in the world. I see democracy being thrown into confusion, uncertainty, lacking above all organizational strength. That's the most important thing. We don't have democratic organizational strength basically anywhere in the world, so I don't see any light for democracy anywhere. I should be very pessimistic, but I also know that in practice, when this happens in the world, democracy organizes itself, but it takes time. don't mourn, organize, as Joe Hill told us. But I also see the quick fixes. I also see that now we have a government campaigner, democracy, yeah, kiddo, yeah, and we're aiming ourselves at young people and school children, all those poor, always these poor school children, and we have a cap on backwards, I would say, yeah, we downright with democracy, kiddies, and we have employed someone for 3 weeks to make a brochure and a website, and we're also on social media, and then and then this campaign is finished, and then we can go have coffee. Democracy is never built that way. It's a grassroots movement. The civil rights movement in the United States were formed during a very, very long time. The workers' movement in Sweden, feminism took like 100 years before it had any results. So democracy takes time, and it's always a grassroots movement, and it's being built from below, and it sort of flourishes. And it's time to start organizing now, because we're in deep shit.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I really want to emphasize on the on the really sad facts that you present, because I was really in a heavy shock when doing some research before this lecture about the fact that the amount of countries or the amount of people living in full democracies around the world has diminished. And do you know how few percentage we're down to now with full democracies?
No.
4.3% of all the people in the world are living in full democracies. And I thought that figure was, I don't know, I hadn't thought about the figure, but if I would guess, I would have said maybe 30%. Yeah, it depends a bit on how, but there are different definitions. But this organization,
I think the US is not included in the full
I know.
democracy in that survey. So it's quite interesting on how they defined it.
Yeah.
Because I would also like to hang on to what you're saying about grassroots democracy, that we sometimes don't think about all the associations we're all part of, even the bostadsrättsförening or, condominium where you live, or your student union here, or, if you're part of a choir or you do something. It's so much run in Sweden, at least, or in the Nordic countries, on democratic associations where there is a board and you can vote, and which I think is one way of looking at grassroots organization beyond, the parliament.
Civil society.
The civil society, and another grassroots organization that Arjuna Padurai has written about is an anthropologist, which is organized globally. Interesting enough, between cities in the world that have that experience big slum areas. So people that live in informal settlements where they have no rights, no identification cards, because they, then you need to have an address, and this is not considered an address. They organize, and they have ideas. I sometimes think they are the ones who will teach us democracy rather than we, go out and preach or, imply, ideas. So I think there is hope, but I do agree.
I have to kavla upp ärmarna.
The American journalist Marsha Gessen, she said, or she wrote just a month ago about this being the actual räddning for, what is it? The saving
Salvation,
of democracy is within the local initiatives coming from below, just as you say, the grassroots.
Me Too is an example. The sort of, it's not a complete political package, but Me Too is an example of a movement which is very hopeful and democratic in such a way. But it has its problems. It has its problems too. Yes, of course it does. It's democratic. It's problematic. That's what defines democratic movements. But,
Yeah, Lulu, or anyone else having a last question or two?
Well, I mean, maybe you have a question? Yeah.
No, I just had a short thought about this thing with freedom, that people want it and then at the same time they don't want it. There's another example from this school world where there's examples of parents that's reacting on democratic work from the teachers. And they're saying, don't you know your job? Like, why would you involve the students? You're the one who studied to become a teacher. You're the one who knows how this is supposed to be run. So I think like freedom might also be connected to responsibility. And responsibility is both interesting and fantastic and builds a person, but it's also exhausting. So I think there's quite a connection there.
Yeah, no, I think my reflection also, listening to you and the discussion, is that I find I'm really struggling with what for me seems to be that even within democracy there is a center point, which is the individual understood as a subject that can possess. It can possess the grasping of the world. It can possess the kind of picturing of the world. It can be the one that is receiving this lineage of wrongdoings, rather than looking at modernity as an ecological disaster. We understand it as this series of wrongdoings against the individual and its capacity of owning knowledge, owning a citizenship, owning, the right to vote. So the statistics that you're mentioning for me is just another proof of maybe this notion is not useful, because there is actually, if you think of democracy, then this pessimist view is obvious. But if there is another way of thinking, the making and breaking of rules and the living together without violence, then maybe I would say that what we can see then is like this ample multitude examples of mutual aid, and what you're saying of collective struggle, of situations where the choices that kind of safeguard us rather than me are around us. Otherwise, actually, the ecological disaster the geo side would already be here. So that's why I find this question: is democracy really? What was it? It was from the students, I think. This question: is democracy vital for the future human? Is it still vital for us to look at democracy as the center of this grand narrative, or is there another way? Well, that's my.
Fråga.
Do you hear me? Yeah.
Ja.
Sorry, I will try to be quite short and synthesize a bit my thoughts, because it's more to reflect on what you said and what you all talked about afterward, when you're talking about the fear of freedom.
Yes.
And also saying that most of the people were happy under a certain regime or are happy today. I'm thinking, I look at the pedagogy of the oppressed, for example, from Paulo Freire, who's talking about the fear of freedom as also being part of a dehumanizing process,
Yes.
where because you don't feel human enough, you don't feel worthy enough, you don't think you deserve this freedom, you can access it. But as soon as you get the tools of education, and not only education, critical education, when you criticize the forms of this oppression, then you feel this freedom belonging to you, because you have the mean to communicate this need for humanization. And I think then to say that most people were happy, or to do this black and white and things that we do on a daily basis, because maybe it's easier to live with this. It's part of a system of oppression. And on the second thought, I'm thinking that this idea of democracy we have today, and the images you showed were also part, and you kind of link it to the Second World War and the Nazi regime. So this idea of democracy is part of the after Second World War math and capitalism. And this idea of freedom has become the freedom to have, to own. when we have America, or the United States, not America, representing this idea of democracy, where capitalism is to own a house, to have your family, to own a dog, to have, and to buy. And this is, we can't say it's an American problem. It is our problem in the Euro-American world. Of course, I'm talking in the Western world. So I think in a democracy that states that our freedom belongs to the freedom to have, and then the access of everyone to buy things, in opposition to the freedom to be, because this we failed to give it. You showed a picture of Nice. You have no freedom to be a Muslim woman in France today, and I think in most of European countries, in most of Western countries, to be a woman, and to be a woman that has a faith, to be a woman who is wearing a sign of this faith. And it's true for many, many things. And I'm thinking then, is there such a thing as democracy? When you say hated democracy, I don't know if I understood it well, but this lack of definition for democracy is because maybe there is none. The ideal of democracy is that we all are equal, but we are not, and it's still failing to give this. So we might have access to goods. We might be free to have, to own, but we still are not accessing the core of democracy. So I think my reflection after what you all said is, and what you said as well, like there is no gathering and there is no organization of democracy today facing the rise of the alt-right, or maybe it's because how to organize in a system that doesn't actually exist. Isn't it just a after trauma, some sort of organization around capitalism, which is European Union, basically, because it was to facilitate also the access of goods without borders. But now we see those borders coming and being the argument for nations. So we still have this discourse of nation states, but when it's a matter of money. Same when democracy is used to go to war, but then we'll sell weapons to the same enemies we are fighting. So are we in a war? Are we in the democracy? What is it actually? I think it has no definition, because I don't think we are in this idea we have of a democracy.
Wow, thank you. It's just struck me that I've never read a white middle-class bourgeoisie rich person in the 1880s saying, "Oh, should I really have freedom? Maybe that's bad for me to have freedom. Maybe I would be unhappy being free," because it's a normative. So that being scared of freedom doesn't seem to apply to be if you're rich white male. Then it's sort of self-evident. We hold those truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yes, but you own slaves, and all men, yeah, but slaves, they are black, they're not proper people, and women are not proper people. They should be afraid of freedom. So a very thought-provocative speech you gave us there. Thank you very much.
One more comment. We have to go.
No, it's just listening to this kind of recalled like once upon a time when I was a happy Soviet citizen and very included in all the systems and very democratic and everything. In my school there was also this like wonderful tree of the social development, how like after feudalism comes capitalism, then comes socialism, eventually you come to the communism and everybody is happy forever. And now listening a bit to this story, it sounds as if like this democracy would be like this, our version of communism. Like, okay, we arrived there and now it's there forever and nobody can endanger it. There is no other like movement direction than backwards. And since a lot of those maybe like forces or powers that you're speaking about, that like you did not specifically mention, okay, if democracy is losing, who is winning, like what that is. But I would assume that in most cases that would be something that is coming to power or to influence through still democratic way one another. And if there are more people who are searching for something else that they are not gaining in that ideology that like you imagine as democracy, can it be that it's not just sort of winning or losing, or just sort of moving forward to some new setup that fits the future in a ways that we still cannot imagine? And that could be ecological, or it could be something else, or just like it will get the name once we see what it has become. That it's not necessarily endangering of that like ideal perfect thing that we sort of arrived at now are at danger to lose, but just sort of this transition into the new perfect thing that we don't know yet.
Well, I would answer that I had a dream today. I had a dream today that one day I will live in a nation where my 4 little children will be judged by the content of a character and not by the color of her skin. I had a dream today that one day Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants will live together and hold hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Now, this was, of course, Martin Luther King in his famous I Had a Dream speech. And in 1968, when he was murdered by racists, that dream seemed possible. It seemed to the world in 1968, and it's 1968 with all its problems, with all its flirtation with totalitarian regimes and whatnot. It seemed that if we've only stretched a bit more, that dream of Martin Luther King would be there. And it's not that problematic a dream, is it? One day I will live in a world where my 4 little children will be judged by the content of a character, not by the skin. I had a dream today. And how come that dream seems to us today much further away? Is it maybe that we think that we think that it's more complicated than it is? It's really not that hard. I end my book by the words, vore det inte bättre om vi var lite hyggliga mot varandra? Would it be better if we were a bit decent towards each other? I tend to think that it's maybe not that complicated that we want it to be.
But you still seem to kind of wish for those huge heroes that has the ultimate grasp of the situation, communicated for the masses. I think that, as an artist, I think what we see is that form comes of the informality. I
think we
and
did
that's an attention to a completely different dimension of
leadership is often based upon people. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Gandalf.
but that movement comes out of also these instances of social improvisation.
Yes, if you look at the American Civil Rights Movement, it's, the bus trip in Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. It's Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King sort of engages in that. But yes, I think personal leadership is a very powerful thing. But that's maybe another discussion. Yeah. Thank you for being so patient.
Welcome back.